For the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about some of the questions that cause us to wonder. As we wrap up this conversation, I want to start this week by getting out some building blocks. The thing about stories is some parts are more important than others. I'm sure you're wondering what that has to do with building blocks in general. And how do building blocks connect to stories? Well, when you're building something, it's important to make sure that what goes on the bottom is strong enough to hold everything else up and that the necessary pieces are firmly in place. In the same way, when it comes to our understanding of the world around us and when it comes to our faith, we want to make sure that it's all built on something solid. The question that we need to ask ourselves as we come to the end of the series is, what foundation are you building your faith on? What holds up your faith? For a lot of us, I think it's two things: Bible stories, right here, and other people's expectations, right here. But there's a problem. What happens when that layer just doesn't hold up any longer? What happens when science bumps up against the stories that we read in the Bible or the faith that's been passed down to us from other people? What happens when that bottom layer just doesn't intersect with real life problems? If someone brings solid evidence to suggest that the stories you believe are false or the traditional beliefs that have been passed down to you by those closest to you, will you hit a crisis in your faith? I think it's very possible. And if someone can disprove your foundation, all the faith that you've built can come crashing down just like these building blocks. But here's the good news. It doesn't have to be this way. Science is not the enemy, even though sometimes it asks questions about our faith that we don't have answers for. We can build our faith on a foundation that stood for nearly 2,000 years and was actually intended to be the foundation of every Christian's faith from the beginning of time. So, what should the bottom block be? What is our foundation? Well, to find out, we have to look back in time at something that happened 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, Jesus, the guy all Christianity is based around, lived and then died by crucifixion on a Roman cross. He claimed to be God and then said and did things that religious leaders couldn't imagine that God would say or even do, because Jesus uplifted people that were normally looked down on. He included people that were normally excluded. He loved and valued people that were typically looked over and passed by. According to one of his closest friends, Matthew, some women were heading to Jesus' tomb after his death, most likely to give him a proper burial following the crucifixion. Then Matthew tells us what happened next. He says, there was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he laid. He didn't stay dead. He resurrected. You don't have to be a scientific genius to know things aren't supposed to happen like that, but it did. And since this event happened over 2,000 years ago, Christians' faith have been built upon the resurrection ever since. One of the most famous Christians of all time, Paul, wrote a letter to a church in Corinth. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. In other words, without the resurrection, everything that we believe is pointless. As you continue to prioritize your foundation of your faith, here's what I want you to do. I want you to build your faith on what matters most, the resurrection. I want to challenge you to do two things this week. One, don't walk away from your faith unnecessarily. If you build your faith on the resurrection, that doesn't have to be the case. You can ask questions, wrestle with scientific evidence, and still keep your faith in place. The second thing is build your faith on what matters most. When you build your faith on what matters most, you will build a faith that lasts. The questions, doubts, or uncertainty that you feel are safe here. And God can handle your doubts and skepticism that science sometimes can raise. As we close this series, I want you to know this. God is a part of how everything works, all of it. God is not outside or threatened by any of it. So as you head into this week, remember that when you build your faith on something solid like the resurrection, you can move around questions that you don't know the answers to. You don't have to dodge them, you don't have to lie about them, but you can rest and have solid foundation believing that Jesus rose from the dead to save all of our lives.